"Sign the nursing home papers, we already packed your things," my son ordered, so I walked into court with the trust he didn't know about, then the judge read the last page. The scent of lavender and mothballs clung to the cardboard boxes stacked in my living room like a funeral shroud over my former life. My existence, neatly folded and sealed with packing tape, was a testament to my own supposed obsolescence. Each box was labeled in my daughter-in-law's perfect, emotionless handwriting: knickknacks, seasonal sweaters, photo albums non-essential. They had packed my memories away as if they were holiday decorations, to be stored in an attic and forgotten until some distant spring cleaning that would never come. My name is Elizabeth Sterling, and they thought they were writing the final chapter of my life. They had no idea I was about to reveal a secret epilogue my husband had written years ago, one that would transform their greed into their downfall. The signs had been there for months, subtle as morning frost on windows. It started with small things, barely noticeable intrusions that I dismissed as the natural adjustment of sharing my home with my son's new family. 3 weeks before that terrible morning in the sunroom, I had spent an entire day preparing dinner for Victoria's book club. I'd made my grandmother's pot roast, the recipe that had won praise at every church social for 30 years. The meat fell apart at the touch of a fork, the gravy was silk, and the Yorkshire pudding rose like golden clouds. I'd set the dining room table with my mother's china, the spode with the blue roses that had survived the Great Depression and 2 world wars. When Victoria's friends arrived, a collection of perfectly coiffed women who spoke in the measured tones of people accustomed to being listened to, I carried the roast to the table with pride. But as I began to serve, Victoria smoothly intercepted. "Ladies, I hope you'll enjoy this family recipe," she said, taking the carving knife from my hands with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's been passed down through generations." She didn't say which generations, and her friends assumed she meant hers. I stood there, invisible in my own dining room, watching these women compliment Victoria on her cooking while I retreated to the kitchen like hired help. Through the swinging door, I heard one of them say, "You're so good to take care of Robert's mother, Victoria. Not everyone would be so accommodating." That night, I found my grandmother's recipe card in the trash, coffee grounds staining the faded ink. When I asked Victoria about it, she looked genuinely puzzled. "Oh, that old thing, I thought you were done with it. I've already entered the recipe into my phone, much more efficient." 2 weeks later, I discovered my wedding album in the basement, relegated to a dusty shelf between paint cans and Christmas decorations. The leather cover, once deep burgundy, had faded to the color of dried blood. I sat on an overturned bucket and opened it, my fingers tracing the edges of photographs that chronicled the happiest day of my life. There was Arthur in his navy dress uniform, so young and handsome it made my chest ache. There was my father walking me down the aisle of St. Mary's, his face proud and solemn. There was my mother adjusting my veil, her own mother's pearls glowing against my throat. I could still smell the orange blossoms in my bouquet, still feel the scratchy lace of my dress against my skin. "Mom, what are you doing down here?" Robert's voice startled me from my reverie. I looked up at my son, this man I'd carried in my body, nursed through fevers, cheered at baseball games. "I was looking for my wedding album. Why is it down here?" He shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet my eyes. "Victoria was organizing. She said it was cluttering up the living room shelves. She thought you might prefer to keep it somewhere safe." Safe, as if my memories were toxic waste to be contained. "This album used to sit on the coffee table," I said quietly. "Your father and I would look through it sometimes, especially on our anniversary." "Well, Dad's gone now, Mom. Maybe it's time to move forward." Move forward? As if love had an expiration date, as if 47 years of marriage could be boxed up and stored away like seasonal clothing. The final straw came just days before that morning in the sunroom. My grandson Tommy, Robert's boy from his first marriage, had come to visit. At 8 years old, he still believed in the magic of grandmothers, still thought my stories were better than television. We were sitting on the porch swing Arthur had built, the one that creaked in exactly the right rhythm for storytelling. Tommy was curled against my side, his head heavy with sleep as I told him about the time his grandfather had caught a fish so big it took both of us to pull it into the boat. "And then what happened, Grandma?" he murmured, his eyes drooping. "Well, your grandfather looked at that fish, all silver and fighting, and you know what he said." "What?" "He said, Elizabeth, anything that fights that hard for its freedom deserves to keep it, so we threw it back." Tommy giggled. Grandpa was silly. "No, sweetheart, your grandfather was wise. He understood that some things are too precious to cage." "Tommy," Victoria's voice cut through the twilight like a blade. She stood in the doorway, her silhouette sharp against the light from inside. "Time for your cognitive enhancement exercises. You're already 20 minutes behind schedule." "But Grandma's telling me about Grandpa," Tommy protested, his small hand tightening on mine. "Your grandmother's stories are lovely, but they won't improve your test scores. Come inside now." I watched my grandson reluctantly slide off the swing, his shoulders slumped with disappointment. As he passed Victoria in the doorway, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Tommy, sweetheart, Grandma sometimes gets confused about the past. It's not her fault, it happens when people get old. But we need to focus on your future, not old stories that may not even be true." The boy looked back at me, confusion clouding his innocent face. In that moment, I saw Victoria's strategy with crystal clarity. She wasn't just erasing me from the present, she was poisoning my past, making my own memories suspect in the eyes of my family. That night, I lay in bed listening to the house settle around me, each creak and whisper a voice from my life with Arthur. This house held our entire story: the pencil marks on the kitchen doorframe where we'd measured Tommy's height, the worn spot on the stairs where Arthur's work boots had climbed for decades, the bathroom mirror that still fogged exactly where his breath used to hit it when he shaved. They weren't just taking my house, they were erasing my history. The scene of my supposed undoing was not a dramatic confrontation, but a quiet, clinical meeting in the sunroom my late husband Arthur had built for me with his own hands. The morning sun streamed through the glass he'd installed pane by pane, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and the cold, hard ambition in my son's eyes. Every board in this room held Arthur's fingerprints. Every joint bore witness to Saturday mornings when he'd worked in his underwear and a faded navy t-shirt, measuring twice and cutting once, whistling old Sinatra songs while I brought him coffee in the mug Tommy had made in kindergarten art class. My son, Robert, and his wife, Victoria, sat across from me at the small wicker table where Arthur and I used to share our morning coffee and plan our days. The table bore scars from 40 years of use, coffee rings, a burn mark from the time I'd absent-mindedly set down a hot iron, ink stains from crossword puzzles we'd worked together on Sunday mornings. Victoria, a woman who treated life like a hostile corporate takeover, placed a thick legal document on that scarred table. The cover page read, "Voluntary Admission and Financial Agreement, Silver Birch Senior Residence." The paper was crisp, expensive, the kind of document that charged by the word and measured compassion in billable hours. "We've made a decision, Mom," Robert said, his voice stripped of all warmth. He had his father's strong jawline but none of the kindness that used to soften Arthur's face when he looked at me. "It's time. We've found a wonderful facility for you." I studied my son's face, searching for the boy who used to climb into our bed during thunderstorms, who'd cried when his goldfish died, who'd asked me to dance at his first wedding when his bride's father had too much to drink. That boy was buried somewhere beneath layers of Victoria's influence and his own greed, suffocated by ambition. "We've already packed your essential things," Victoria added, her tone suggesting she had just completed a difficult but necessary corporate merger. She spoke of my life as if it were an inefficient department being downsized, a redundant position being eliminated for the greater good of the company. She slid the document towards me with manicured fingers, each nail a perfect coral shell. The pen was already clicked, ready for my signature like a loaded gun. I looked down at the paper, then at the boxes that had replaced the furniture, the art, the life in my own home. My grandmother's rocking chair where I'd nursed Robert through colic and read him bedtime stories was gone. The painting Arthur had given me for our 10th anniversary, a watercolor of the lake where we'd spent our honeymoon, had been replaced by a modern print that matched Victoria's vision of proper decor. "And what if I don't want to go?" I asked, my voice a quiet thread in the suffocating silence. Robert sighed, a sound of profound, weary impatience. It was the same sigh he'd used as a teenager when I'd asked him to take out the trash or finish his homework. The same sigh that said his mother was an inconvenience, a problem to be managed. "Mom, don't be difficult, we've been over this, you're becoming forgetful, you left the stove on last week. The doctor says you need round-the-clock care, this is for your own good." The lie was so blatant, so perfectly delivered, it almost took my breath away. I hadn't left the stove on. Victoria had, while rushing out to her tennis lesson with the same urgency she brought to everything that mattered to her. She'd been heating soup for a late lunch, then abandoned it when her friend called to say the court was available early. I'd come home from my weekly visit to Arthur's grave to find smoke filling the kitchen and the soup pot scorched black on the burner. When I asked Victoria about it later, she'd looked at me with theatrical concern and said, "Oh, Mom, you really don't remember turning on the stove, Dr. Matthews warned us this might happen." Dr. Matthews, the doctor who was nothing more than a friend of Victoria's, a concierge physician they had paid for a single assessment. He'd spent 15 minutes in my living room, asked me 3 questions: what year is it? Who's the president? Can you count backward from 100 by sevens? And then declared me at risk for cognitive decline. I'd answered all his questions correctly, but apparently my answers weren't the ones Victoria wanted to hear. "This house is a valuable asset," Victoria said, cutting to the heart of the matter with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. "We can't have it tied up while you're declining. By signing these forms, you voluntarily cede control of your assets to Robert as your legal guardian to manage your care. The sale of the house will fund your stay at Silver Birch indefinitely." Legal guardian? The words were a cage made of legal jargon and false concern. They weren't just taking my home, they were taking my personhood, reducing me to the status of a child who couldn't be trusted with her own life. I thought of Arthur in that moment, of his strong hands and his steady voice, of the way he'd hold me when nightmares woke me, whispering, "I've got you, Liz, I've got you, and I'm not letting go." But Arthur was gone, and his son was trying to sell the fortress he'd built for me. My ledger, my book of accounting, wasn't written in ink on paper. It was carved in stone, etched in granite, as permanent as the mountains Arthur had quarried in his youth. After Arthur, a brilliant stonemason, passed away from the lung disease that claimed so many men of his trade, silicosis from years of breathing granite dust that turned his lungs to stone, I commissioned a simple memorial bench in his name at the local botanical garden. The bench sat beside the rose garden he'd loved, where we'd walked every Sunday after church, where he'd proposed on a spring morning when the air was sweet with blooming apple trees. But on the back of that bench, hidden from public view where only I would ever see it, I had asked the engraver to carve a single private line: "He built monuments, I will protect them." Arthur understood stone, and he understood people. He knew they could be beautiful and strong, or they could be brittle and crumble under pressure. In the months before his death, when the disease had already started its cruel work, he'd grown increasingly worried about Victoria's influence over our son. "She doesn't see a family, Liz," he'd told me one evening, his voice rough with the cough that would eventually silence him forever. His hands, calloused and strong despite his illness, covered mine as we sat on this very sunroom. "She sees a balance sheet. She sees our life's work as a line item on her future portfolio, and Robert, he wants her approval more than he wants to honor our past." His words had seemed harsh then, the bitter observations of a dying man watching his son's marriage dissolve his first wife's memory. But Arthur had always been able to see the structure beneath the surface, the foundation that would hold and the cracks that would eventually bring everything down. It was then that he revealed his final masterpiece, a legal structure as intricate and unbreakable as the granite foundations he used to lay. He had taken the bulk of his estate, his business, the properties he'd bought with 40 years of sweat and skill, the investments he'd made with the careful precision of a man who knew the value of hard work, and placed it all into an irrevocable trust. The Sterling Legacy Trust was Arthur's greatest creation, worth over $10 million. It was built like his stonework, beautiful, functional, and designed to last forever. Robert is the beneficiary, of course, he'd explained one afternoon when the pain medication made him more talkative than usual. We were sitting in the hospital room where he'd spend his final weeks, and he was sketching the trust structure on the back of a magazine with a pencil worn down to a stub. But he doesn't inherit it outright. He only receives a modest annual stipend, $50,000 a year, enough to live comfortably but not lavishly. The principal, the real wealth, remains locked away. I hadn't understood the full implications then. $50,000 seemed like a fortune to me, more than Arthur and I had ever made in a single year, but Arthur's eyes held a sadness that spoke of deeper wisdom. There's a fail-safe, Liz, a final clause buried deep in the legal language where most people won't notice it. Article 7, Section C. I call it the character clause. The trust is to be fully and immediately dispersed to Robert, granting him complete control of the entire $10 million on one condition: if a court of law ever deems you, his mother, to be legally incapacitated and in need of a guardian. I had stared at him, confused and hurt. But Arthur, why would you do that? Why would you reward him for having me declared incompetent? His smile was sad, full of a love so deep it transcended death itself. Because, my darling, it's a trap, a loyalty test from beyond the grave. If he truly loves you, if he truly honors what we built together, he will protect your independence at all costs, even if it means he never gets his hands on the fortune. But if he tries to take your freedom to get his money, well, then he will get exactly what he deserves. He had tapped the final page of the trust document with a finger that trembled slightly from medication. The judge will have to read the last part of Article 7, Section C, out loud in court. It's a legal requirement for this type of trust dissolution, every word of it. Now, sitting in my sunroom surrounded by boxes that contained the debris of my dismantled life, I understood Arthur's genius. This wasn't just an attempt to take my house. This was their final move to unlock the $10 million they'd been coveting since the day Arthur died. They thought they were being clever, forcing my hand with their fake medical assessment and their carefully staged evidence of my declining mental state. They thought they were one signature away from their inheritance. I won't sign, I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. Victoria's face hardened like concrete setting in the sun. The mask of concerned daughter-in-law slipped, revealing the predator beneath. We were afraid you'd say that. That's why we've already filed a petition with the probate court. We have a hearing on Friday. She leaned forward, her coral nails drumming against the table in a rhythm that reminded me of rain on a coffin lid. We're petitioning for emergency guardianship based on your declining cognitive state. Our lawyer says it's a slam dunk. The judge will see you're being stubborn and irrational and rule in our favor. You can either sign these papers and go to a nice facility with dignity or be legally ordered into one by a judge. The outcome is the same, Mom. The house gets sold. They had planned for everything except the truth. Friday, you say? I asked, a strange calm settling over me like fresh snow on a winter morning. I'll be there. Victoria exchanged a look with Robert, the kind of look that passed between co-conspirators who thought they'd just witnessed their victim's final surrender. I didn't call a lawyer. I was already represented by the best advocate I could ask for, my late husband, speaking through documents they'd never bothered to read completely. The days between that sunroom confrontation and the Friday hearing passed like a fever dream. I moved through my emptied house like a ghost, each footstep echoing in rooms stripped of everything that had made them home. But I wasn't idle during those days. While Robert and Victoria made their final preparations for what they believed would be my legal execution, I was making preparations of my own. I visited Arthur's grave every morning, carrying fresh flowers and sitting on the cold marble bench nearby. The headstone was simple granite, cut and polished by his own apprentices according to his exact specifications. Arthur Sterling, he built beauty that endures. Below that, the dates that bracketed a life well lived. They think they've won, my love, I whispered to the stone, my breath visible in the crisp autumn air. They think your boy has forgotten everything you taught him about honor and loyalty. The wind rustled through the oak tree Arthur had planted there 20 years ago, its branches now strong enough to shelter his resting place. I traced the letters of his name with my finger, feeling the skilled craftsmanship even in death's monument. But you knew this day would come, didn't you? You prepared for it, just like you prepared for everything else. You always said the strongest foundations are the ones nobody sees until they're tested. On Tuesday, I called my old friend Margaret, Arthur's former secretary who'd helped him set up the trust paperwork. She was 84 now, sharp as a tack and still volunteering at the legal aid clinic downtown. "Elizabeth Sterling, you beautiful fool," she said when she heard my voice. "I was wondering when you'd call. That husband of yours was a clever one, rest his soul. He made me promise to explain everything to you if this day ever came." We met at the diner where Arthur used to take his crew for lunch, a place that still served coffee strong enough to wake the dead and pie made from scratch by women who'd learned the recipes from their grandmothers. Margaret spread the trust documents across the cracked formica table, her gnarled fingers tracing the legal language with the familiarity of someone who'd typed every word. "Your Arthur was a chess player, honey, always thinking 3 moves ahead. See this clause here?" She pointed to a paragraph buried deep in the document, the type so small I needed my reading glasses to make it out. "This is where he got creative. See, most people would stop reading after Article 7, Section B. They'd see the $10 million payout and start counting their money, but Arthur knew greed makes people stupid. He knew they'd never read to the end." She smiled, the expression transforming her wrinkled face into something beautiful and fierce. "Your boy's about to learn that his father was smarter than he ever imagined." On Wednesday, I did something I hadn't done in months. I cooked. Not the simple meals I'd been preparing for myself, but the kind of feast Arthur used to request for his birthday. Pot roast with vegetables, mashed potatoes with real butter, green beans that had simmered all day with bacon and onions, and apple pie made with fruit from the tree Arthur had planted the year Robert was born. I set the dining room table with my mother's china, the good silverware, and the crystal glasses we'd received as a wedding gift. I lit candles and put on the Sinatra album Arthur loved, the one we used to dance to in the kitchen when we thought no one was watching. Then I sat down alone and ate my final meal in the house I'd called home for 47 years. Each bite was a memory, the pot roast recipe I'd learned from Arthur's mother, who'd accepted me despite my humble background because she saw how much I loved her son. The mashed potatoes I'd made for Robert when he was teething, soft enough for sore gums but rich enough to make him smile. The apple pie that had won 3 blue ribbons at the county fair before Victoria declared such competitions quaint and beneath our family's dignity. After dinner, I washed every dish by hand, dried them with the same tea towels I'd used for decades, and put them away in their proper places. If this was to be my last night as mistress of this house, I wanted to leave it the way Arthur would have wanted, clean, orderly, and loved. Thursday morning brought unexpected visitors. Robert appeared at my door alone without Victoria, looking haggard and nervous. He'd lost weight, I noticed, and there were dark circles under his eyes that made him look older than his 42 years. "Mom, can we talk?" he asked, his voice softer than it had been in months. I let him in, led him to the kitchen where we'd had so many conversations over the years. The room felt different without its usual clutter of life, no newspapers folded open to the crossword puzzle, no coffee rings on the counter, no evidence that anyone actually lived here. I've been thinking about what you said, he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with words that wanted to stay buried, about not wanting to go to Silver Birch. For a moment, I saw a glimmer of the boy I'd raised, the child who used to crawl into my lap when he was frightened, who told me all his secrets and trusted me to keep them safe. Maybe we could find another solution, he continued, not quite meeting my eyes. Maybe you could stay here and we could hire someone to check on you, a companion or something. Hope fluttered in my chest like a bird trying to escape a cage. Had Arthur's son finally remembered his father's lessons about loyalty and love? But then I saw him glance toward the window and I followed his gaze to see Victoria sitting in their car, her phone pressed to her ear, her face sharp with impatience. What does Victoria think about this new plan? I asked quietly. Robert's shoulders sagged and I knew the answer before he spoke. She thinks it's too risky. What if something happens to you? What if you fall or have an accident? We'd be responsible. In the house, I pressed. If I stay, the house stays off the market. He looked at his hands, unable to meet my eyes. We'd have to discuss that, the maintenance costs alone. I understood then that this visit wasn't about finding a solution. It was about easing his conscience before the execution. He wanted to be able to tell himself he'd tried, that he'd offered me an alternative even as he prepared to have me declared incompetent. Robert, I said gently, reaching across the table to touch his hand, do you remember what your father used to say about integrity? He looked up, startled by the question. He used to say that integrity is what you do when no one is watching. It's the foundation everything else is built on. Without it, even the most beautiful structure will eventually crumble. Robert pulled his hand away, unable to bear the weight of his father's memory. Mom, this isn't about integrity. This is about taking care of you. This is about being practical. Is it, I asked, or is it about the money? The question hung between us like smoke from a fire that had burned everything it touched. Robert stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. I'll see you in court tomorrow, Mom, he said, and there was something like sadness in his voice. I hope someday you'll understand that we're doing this because we love you. After he left, I sat in the quiet kitchen and felt Arthur's presence as clearly as if he were sitting beside me. I could almost hear his voice, rough with emotion but steady with conviction. You know what you have to do, Liz. You know how this ends. Yes, I thought, I know how this ends. The courtroom was a cold, impersonal space of polished wood and muted light, where justice was supposed to be blind but often seemed merely indifferent. High ceilings amplified every whisper, every shuffled paper, every nervous cough into a symphony of human frailty. Robert and Victoria sat at the petitioner's table with their slick, expensive lawyer, a man named Mr. Davies who wore his success like an expensive cologne, subtle but unmistakable. His suit probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, his briefcase was leather soft as butter, and his confidence filled the room like smoke from an expensive cigar. They looked the part of concerned children forced to make a difficult decision by cruel circumstance. Victoria had dressed carefully for the role, a navy blue dress that suggested competence without appearing cold, minimal jewelry that spoke of good taste rather than wealth, and just enough makeup to look fresh but not calculated. She'd even practiced her expressions in the mirror. I was certain the slight downturn of her mouth that suggested reluctant sadness, the way she touched Robert's arm as if drawing strength from their united purpose. Robert wore his grief like an ill-fitting suit, constantly adjusting it but never quite comfortable. He kept glancing toward the door as if hoping for rescue, his fingers drumming against the table in the same nervous rhythm he'd had as a child when called to the principal's office. I sat alone at the respondent's table, my hands folded in my lap, wearing the simple black dress I'd worn to Arthur's funeral. It seemed appropriate somehow. This was a funeral of sorts, the burial of my son's honor and my trust in him. The bailiff, a kind-faced woman who reminded me of my sister, had offered me a glass of water when I'd arrived. You holding up okay, honey? she'd asked quietly, and something in her tone told me she'd seen too many scenes like this one, too many families torn apart by greed masquerading as concern. When Judge Miller entered the courtroom, we all rose. She was a formidable woman in her 60s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades separating truth from fiction, wheat from chaff. Her black robes seemed to carry the weight of every difficult decision she'd ever made. "Please be seated," she said, her voice carrying easily through the high-ceilinged room. "We're here today to consider the petition of Robert Sterling and Victoria Sterling for emergency guardianship of Elizabeth Sterling." Mr. Davies rose smoothly, his opening statement polished as marble. He painted a picture of a woman in decline, a loving family struggling with the heartbreaking decision to override their mother's wishes for her own protection. He cited my forgetfulness, my stubbornness, my inability to make rational decisions about my own care. He made me sound like a child who'd lost her way in a department store, confused and frightened, in need of strong hands to guide her home. Victoria took the witness stand first, her testimony a masterpiece of manufactured concern. She spoke of finding me disoriented in the kitchen, of my increasing confusion about dates and times, of her fear that I would hurt myself living alone in such a large house. "We love her so much," she said, her voice breaking at exactly the right moment. "This is the hardest thing we've ever had to do, but we can't stand by and watch her deteriorate. The Elizabeth we know and love would want us to protect her, even from herself." She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, the picture of a daughter-in-law sacrificing her own comfort for the greater good. Robert's testimony was briefer but no less damaging. He spoke of his father's death, of how my grief had affected my judgment, of his obligation as my only child to ensure my safety and well-being. "My father would never forgive me if I let anything happen to her," he said, and those words cut deeper than any knife. Because they might have been true once upon a time when he was still the son Arthur had raised rather than the man Victoria had shaped. When Judge Miller asked if I had legal representation, I stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. "Your Honor," I said, my voice clear and steady despite the earthquake in my chest, "I do not have a lawyer present, but I would like to submit a document into evidence. It is the last will and testament and trust agreement of my late husband, Arthur Sterling." A ripple of confusion passed through the courtroom. Mr. Davies shot to his feet like a puppet on strings, his practiced composure cracking slightly. "Objection, Your Honor, this is a guardianship hearing, not a probate matter. The deceased's will is irrelevant to the respondent's current cognitive state." Judge Miller peered at me over her reading glasses, her expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Sterling, what is the relevance of this document to the matter at hand?" "It is directly relevant to the motivations behind this petition, Your Honor," I said, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "Specifically, Article 7, Section C, I ask that the court read it into the record." I saw Victoria lean forward, whispering urgently to Mr. Davies. Robert's face had gone pale, confusion and the first glimmer of fear fighting for control of his features. Mr. Davies looked like a man who just realized he was standing in quicksand. We have no objection to the document being reviewed, Your Honor, though we maintain its irrelevance to these proceedings." The bailiff brought the sealed document to Judge Miller's bench. The courtroom was silent except for the whisper of pages turning, the soft rustle of legal paper that held the power to change lives forever. Judge Miller read silently for several minutes, her expression neutral as stone. Then, as she reached Article 7, I saw her eyebrows begin to climb. Her mouth tightened almost imperceptibly, and she looked up at Robert and Victoria with new interest. "Article 7, Section C," she read aloud, her voice filling the courtroom like the voice of justice itself. "The character clause, the principal of the Sterling Legacy Trust, valued at approximately $10 million, shall be immediately and fully disbursed to my son, Robert Sterling, upon the event that his mother, Elizabeth Sterling, is declared legally incapacitated by a court of law and a legal guardian is appointed for her person and her estate." A wave of murmurs went through the small courtroom gallery. Mr. Davies's jaw dropped like a stone into still water. Robert and Victoria were staring at the judge, their faces a mixture of shock and triumphant greed, like gamblers who'd just seen their number come up on the wheel. They thought they had won. They thought this was the final rubber stamp on their victory, the legal blessing on their inheritance. But Judge Miller wasn't finished reading. However, she continued, her voice hardening like metal cooling in winter air, this disbursement is subject to the final provision detailed on the following page. She paused, removing her reading glasses to clean them with deliberate care. When she put them back on, her gaze settled on Robert and Victoria like a judge at the final tribunal. Should this legal action for guardianship be initiated by my son, Robert Sterling, or his spouse, it will be understood as a direct and irrefutable act of familial betrayal, motivated by greed rather than concern. It will prove him to be a man who would sacrifice his own mother's freedom for financial gain. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, the kind of quiet that comes just before thunder. Therefore, Judge Miller continued, should he be the one to trigger this clause, the following shall occur immediately and without possibility of appeal or reversal. She took a deep breath, looking first at me, then at my son. Her voice when she continued was steady as stone, final as a closing door. 1. The full $10 million principal of the Sterling Legacy Trust is to be immediately and irrevocably donated to the National Center for Elder Justice to be used in their fight against the financial abuse of seniors. Victoria made a sound like air being let out of a balloon. Her perfect composure cracked, revealing the raw panic beneath. 2. My son, Robert Sterling, is to be permanently and forever disinherited from any and all assets, properties, and monies related to my estate. This includes but is not limited to his current annual stipend, which is hereby terminated effective immediately. Robert's face had gone the color of old paper, his mouth opening and closing like a fish drowning in air. 3. All properties currently held in trust, including the family home, my workshop, and all their contents, are to be placed in a separate trust for the sole benefit of my loving and loyal wife, Elizabeth, to be managed by her as she sees fit for the remainder of her natural life. Judge Miller paused again, her eyes narrowing as she read the final, brutal line that Arthur had crafted with the precision of a master craftsman delivering the killing blow. And 4. My son and his wife are to be given 24 hours to vacate any properties owned or controlled by the Sterling Family Trust. They are hereby permanently barred from entering said properties or making any claim upon them. She looked up from the document, her gaze finding Robert's terrified eyes across the courtroom. The document concludes with this statement: my son wanted my fortune. Instead, he will inherit the consequences of his character. I built my legacy on stone and steel, on loyalty and love. He has chosen to build his on sand and greed. May God have mercy on his soul, because his father will not. The collective gasp that went through the courtroom sounded like the last breath of the dying. Victoria made a small, choking noise, her perfectly manicured hand flying to her throat as if she were suffocating. Her face had gone ashen, all her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the terror that drained the blood from her cheeks. Robert looked like he had been physically struck by a sledgehammer, his body seeming to shrink in his expensive suit until he resembled nothing so much as a child who'd been caught stealing from his mother's purse. His mouth moved soundlessly, forming words that wouldn't come, apologies that were 40 years too late. Mr. Davies was shuffling papers with hands that trembled slightly, his professional composure cracking like ice in spring. The confident lawyer who'd entered this courtroom expecting an easy victory now looked like a man who realized he'd been played by a dead master strategist, outmaneuvered by a ghost who'd anticipated every move. Judge Miller removed her glasses again, this time to study the faces of the people before her. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades spent separating truth from lies, justice from mere law. Mr. Sterling, she said, addressing Robert directly, in 32 years on this bench I have presided over thousands of guardianship hearings. I have seen children genuinely concerned about aging parents, families struggling with impossible decisions, and yes, I have seen cases where legal guardianship was truly necessary for the protection of vulnerable adults. She paused, letting her words settle like dust after an explosion. But I have never seen a more elegant or profound testament to a man's understanding of character or lack thereof. Your father, sir, was clearly a man who understood human nature in all its complexity. He built what can only be described as a loyalty test from beyond the grave, a final examination of the values he tried to instill in his son. Robert tried to speak, his voice coming out as a croak. Your Honor, this isn't about money, we genuinely believed. Stop, Judge Miller's voice cut through his protests like a blade through silk. Mr. Sterling, your father's document makes it clear that he anticipated this exact scenario. He knew that if you truly loved and respected your mother, you would protect her independence at all costs, even if it meant never receiving your inheritance. He gambled everything on the hope that he had raised a son with integrity. She looked at him with something that might have been pity if it weren't so cold. You have just proven him wrong in the most public and permanent way possible. The judge turned her attention to Victoria, who sat frozen in her chair like a statue carved from pure terror. Mrs. Sterling, your role in this proceeding has been noted. The court finds your testimony to be not only misleading but deliberately fabricated for the purpose of financial gain. The medical assessment you provided has been exposed as a sham, conducted by a physician with no specialization in geriatric care who spent less than 20 minutes with the supposed patient. Victoria's carefully constructed mask finally shattered completely. This is insane, she burst out, her voice shrill with desperation. You can't let a dead man's revenge fantasy override legitimate concerns about an elderly woman's safety. The outburst sealed her fate. Judge Miller's expression hardened to granite. Mrs. Sterling, you have just demonstrated exactly the kind of character your late father-in-law was warning against. This courtroom has heard your legitimate concerns, and we have also heard the truth. The court finds that this petition for guardianship was filed not out of love or concern but out of pure, calculating greed. She turned back to the document, her voice taking on the formal cadence of legal pronouncement. This petition for emergency guardianship is not only denied, it is dismissed with extreme prejudice. Furthermore, I am ordering that copies of these proceedings be forwarded to the district attorney's office for investigation into possible elder abuse and fraud. The gavel came down with the finality of a coffin nail. Mrs. Elizabeth Sterling, you are free to return to your home. The court finds you to be of sound mind and fully capable of managing your own affairs. This proceeding is concluded. I didn't look at Robert as I walked out of that courtroom. I didn't need to. I had already seen everything I needed to see in his face when the judge read Arthur's final words. The boy I had raised, the son I had loved, was gone. In his place sat a stranger who had sold his birthright for a handful of silver, who had chosen greed over love, comfort over character. But as I stepped into the sunlight outside the courthouse, I felt Arthur's presence as clearly as if he were walking beside me. I could almost hear his voice, rough with emotion but steady with satisfaction. Well done, my love, well done. The next 24 hours were a blur of frantic activity at my house, a desperate ballet of greed finally meeting its consequences. They didn't hire movers, there wasn't time, and besides, what moving company would take a job from people who might not be able to pay? Instead, Robert and Victoria threw their belongings into their cars themselves, their movements jerky and desperate like marionettes controlled by a drunken puppet master. Designer clothing was crammed into garbage bags, expensive electronics were wrapped hastily in towels, and Victoria's precious art collection, the pieces she'd used to replace my family photos, were stacked carelessly in the back of their SUV. I watched from my bedroom window as Victoria screamed into her phone at Mr. Davies, her voice carrying across the yard in fragments. Sue for malpractice, didn't warn us, incompetent legal advice. The lawyer who'd been so confident just hours before was apparently less eager to take her calls now that the bill was coming due. Robert moved like a man in a dream or perhaps a nightmare. He loaded boxes with the mechanical precision of someone whose mind had simply shut down to protect itself from the enormity of what he'd lost. Every so often he would stop and stare at the house, his childhood home, the place where his father had taught him to ride a bicycle and throw a baseball, where his mother had nursed him through fevers and celebrated his achievements. I saw him pause at the kitchen window, his hand pressed against the glass where he used to leave fingerprints as a child. For a moment, his face crumpled with something that might have been regret, but then Victoria's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Robert, we don't have time for nostalgia," and the moment passed. The neighbors had begun to gather, drawn by the unusual activity and the raised voices. Mrs. Patterson from next door stood on her porch with her arms crossed, her expression making it clear that she'd already chosen sides. The Johnsons from across the street were less subtle, standing openly in their front yard to get a better view of the drama unfolding. Victoria noticed the audience and tried to salvage some dignity, straightening her shoulders and lifting her chin as if she were making a strategic retreat rather than fleeing in disgrace. But the effect was ruined when she stumbled trying to carry too many boxes at once, designer shoes scattered across the driveway like exclamation points of defeat. I didn't stay to watch the final act of their departure. Something about witnessing my son's complete humiliation felt too much like participating in it, and despite everything he'd done, he was still the child I'd carried for 9 months, still the boy who'd once brought me dandelions and called them flowers. Instead, I went to the botanical garden and sat on Arthur's bench. The roses were past their prime now, heavy-headed with autumn's approach, but they still carried the sweet scent that had drawn him here every Sunday after church. I traced the carved inscription with my finger. He built monuments. "I will protect them," and whispered the words I'd been carrying in my heart since the courtroom. "You did it, my love, you protected me." The words were carried away on the breeze that rustled through the oak tree he'd planted, its branches now strong enough to weather any storm. When I returned home an hour later, the house was empty of everything that didn't belong. The quiet that filled the space wasn't the hollow silence of abandonment, it was the deep peace of a home reclaimed, of a sanctuary restored to its rightful guardian. The boxes they'd packed were gone, of course, taken in their hasty retreat. But what remained was everything that truly mattered. The pencil marks on the kitchen doorframe where we'd measured Robert's height as he grew, the worn spot on the hardwood floor where Arthur used to pace when he was working out a problem. The view from the sunroom where we'd shared 47 years of morning coffee and quiet conversation. I walked through each room slowly, reacquainting myself with the space that was fully mine again. In the living room, I could almost see Arthur in his favorite chair, reading the evening paper with his glasses sliding down his nose. In the kitchen, I could smell the phantom aroma of Sunday morning pancakes and hear the echo of laughter from birthday parties and holiday dinners. The house felt larger somehow, as if removing the weight of Robert and Victoria's presence had allowed it to expand back to its natural dimensions. The walls seemed to breathe again, the windows let in more light, and even the floorboards seemed to settle with relief. That evening, I received my first phone call. It was Margaret, Arthur's former secretary, her voice bright with satisfaction. "Elizabeth Sterling, you magnificent woman, the news is all over town. That courthouse clerk, Jenny Morrison, she's my neighbor's niece, and she said Judge Miller was practically glowing when she came back to chambers. Apparently, she called it the most satisfying case she's presided over in years." I smiled, settling into the kitchen chair where Arthur used to read his morning paper. He would have enjoyed that, wouldn't he? Arthur always said the best revenge was letting people hang themselves with their own rope. "Honey, your husband didn't just give them rope, he built them a whole gallows and then sat back to watch them use it. That man was playing chess while they were playing checkers." Over the next few days, the calls kept coming. Old friends I hadn't heard from in months, neighbors who'd been keeping their distance during Robert and Victoria's reign, even strangers who'd heard about the case through the courthouse grapevine. Each conversation was a thread in the fabric of community support I'd forgotten I had. Mrs. Patterson brought over a casserole and stayed for tea, confessing that she'd never liked Victoria but hadn't known how to say so. "That woman always looked at this house like she was calculating its square footage," she said, shaking her gray head. "Your Arthur saw right through her, didn't he?" The Johnsons stopped by with flowers from their garden, the husband shuffling his feet in embarrassment. "We should have said something," he admitted. "We could see what was happening, but we didn't know how to help. Your husband raised a good man in Robert, but somewhere along the way that boy lost his compass." "People have to choose their own path," I told him, surprised by the peace I felt saying those words. "Arthur gave Robert every tool he needed to build a good life. What he chose to build with them was up to him." My story didn't end with Robert and Victoria's departure. It began there, like a phoenix rising from the ashes of betrayal, like a garden growing from soil fertilized by disappointment. With my home secure and my future no longer under threat, I turned my attention to Arthur's true legacy, not the money he'd left, but the wisdom embedded in his final masterpiece. The $10 million had been donated to the National Center for Elder Justice as specified in the trust, but that was just the beginning. I established the Sterling Shield Foundation with my own resources, Arthur's life insurance, my teacher's pension, and the modest savings we'd accumulated over 5 decades of careful living. Our mission was elegantly simple: to provide pro bono legal services to elderly people who were facing predatory guardianship petitions from their own families. We became a firewall for the vulnerable, a shield against the very people who should have been their protectors. Our first case came to us through Margaret, who'd started volunteering at the legal aid clinic with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found her true calling at 84. George Hendricks was a 78-year-old farmer whose 3 children were trying to force him into a nursing home so they could sell his 200-acre farm to developers. "They say I'm too old to work the land," George told me when we met in the office I'd rented above the bakery on Main Street. His hands were gnarled with arthritis but still strong, still bearing the calluses of a lifetime spent coaxing crops from stubborn soil. "But this land has been in my family for 4 generations. My great-grandfather cleared it with his own hands, my grandfather survived the Dust Bowl here, my father brought it back to life after the war. And now my own children want to sell it to some corporation that'll cover it with strip malls and parking lots." His story was a variation on my own theme: love twisted into a weapon, family bonds corrupted by greed. His children lived in distant cities now, their own children more familiar with iPads than corn fields, their lives so far removed from the land that had sustained their family that they saw it as nothing more than a real estate opportunity. We fought for George with the ferocity of people who understood what was at stake. Our lawyer, a young woman named Sarah Chen who specialized in elder law, dismantled the children's case piece by piece. Their claims about George's mental capacity crumbled under the weight of testimony from neighbors who saw him every day, from his doctor who confirmed his sharp mind and strong body, from the agricultural extension agent who consulted with him regularly about crop management. When the judge dismissed their petition, George wept openly in the courtroom. "I can die on my own land now," he whispered to me as we left the courthouse. "I can be buried next to my Mary, and I know the corn will keep growing." Our second case was Mary Washington, a widow whose daughter had been systematically draining her bank accounts for 3 years before filing for guardianship to cover her tracks. The daughter, a middle-aged woman with a gambling addiction and a talent for manipulation, had convinced several of Mary's friends that her mother was losing her grip on reality. "She'd take me to the bank," Mary told us, her voice shaking with remembered fear. "Stand right beside me while I withdrew money for her emergency, then she'd cry about how worried she was about my memory, how I was forgetting I'd given her the money." The psychological abuse was as devastating as the financial theft. Mary had begun to doubt her own mind, to question memories that were as clear as crystal simply because her daughter insisted they were false. Sarah Chen worked with a forensic accountant to trace every stolen dollar while I spent hours with Mary, helping her rebuild confidence in her own perceptions. We connected her with other victims of financial abuse, women who understood the particular cruelty of being betrayed by someone you'd given life to. When we won Mary's case, not only stopping the guardianship petition but securing criminal charges against her daughter, Mary donated her first recovered funds to the Sterling Shield Foundation. "You gave me back my mind," she said, pressing the check into my hands. "Now help someone else find theirs." Case by case, victory by victory, our reputation grew. We became the law firm that predatory family members feared, the advocates that vulnerable seniors could count on. Word of mouth carried our mission across the state, then across the region, as more and more elderly people found the courage to fight back against those who saw their frailty as opportunity. Within 2 years, we'd handled over 100 cases. We won 87% of them, and even the losses served a purpose, establishing legal precedents that made future abuse more difficult, creating a paper trail that warned other potential predators that their victims weren't as defenseless as they appeared. The work was hard, often heartbreaking. For every George we saved, there was a Helen who called too late after the nursing home papers were already signed and the family home was already sold. For every Mary whose money we recovered, there was a William whose son had already spent the inheritance on luxury cars and gambling debts. But the victories sustained us, and they multiplied like seeds scattered on fertile ground. One autumn afternoon, exactly 3 years after that terrible day in my sunroom, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a small, exquisitely carved stone rose, its petals so detailed they seemed to catch and hold the light. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, the work of someone who understood stone the way Arthur had, who could coax beauty from the hardest materials. The note was written in shaky handwriting. "Mrs. Sterling, you saved my grandfather's farm. This is from the stone wall he built with his own hands 60 years ago. Thank you for being our shield. Tommy Hendricks, age 12." I placed the rose on the mantelpiece in the sunroom, right where the silver birch brochure had sat during those dark days. It was a monument not to what I had lost but to what we had built, a legacy measured not in dollars hoarded but in lives protected, not in wealth accumulated but in dignity preserved. More roses followed over the months and years. Each one was different, some carved by professional artisans, others shaped by amateur hands guided by grateful hearts. Some were made from granite like Arthur's work, others from marble, limestone, even driftwood and clay. But each one represented a victory, a family saved from predators, an elderly person whose independence had been preserved. My mantelpiece became a garden of stone, a memorial to battles won and dignity restored. I never heard from Robert or Victoria again, though information filtered back through the network of gossip that connects all small towns. They had divorced within 6 months of leaving my house, their marriage unable to survive the loss of the fortune they'd gambled everything to obtain. Victoria, stripped of the lifestyle she felt entitled to, had moved to Phoenix to live with her sister. The reports suggested she'd found work in real estate, perhaps fitting work for someone who understood the art of separating people from their homes. Robert had taken a sales job with an agricultural equipment company in Kansas, a ghost of the man he might have been if he'd chosen differently. Some said he'd started drinking, others whispered about depression, about a man who'd lost more than money when he'd lost his father's respect. I felt no satisfaction in his suffering, no joy in his downfall. The boy I'd raised was gone, had been gone long before that courtroom scene, replaced by someone I no longer recognized. What I felt was the deep sadness of a mother mourning a child who was still breathing but had died in all the ways that mattered. Sometimes, late at night when the house was quiet and full of memories, I would wonder if there had been something I could have done differently. Some word I could have spoken, some boundary I could have drawn, some way to save the boy I'd loved from becoming the man who'd betrayed me. But Arthur's voice would whisper through the darkness, carrying the wisdom of stone and time. You can't save someone from their own choices, Liz. You can only love them and hope they remember who they used to be. 5 years after the courtroom confrontation that changed everything, the Sterling Shield Foundation had become a nationally recognized organization. We'd handled over 500 cases, saved countless families from predatory guardianship schemes, and helped recover millions of dollars in stolen assets. But the real measure of our success wasn't in numbers. It was in the letters that arrived daily, in the phone calls from strangers who'd found the courage to fight back, in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that Arthur's final lesson was still protecting people he'd never met. One letter particularly moved me. It came from a woman in Oregon whose son had tried to have her declared incompetent after she'd been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's. "Mrs. Sterling," she wrote, "I heard about your foundation on the news and it gave me the strength to fight back. My son thought my diagnosis meant I'd become helpless, someone he could control and manipulate. But your story showed me that having Alzheimer's doesn't mean giving up my rights or my dignity. With help from a lawyer you recommended, I was able to set up my own care plan and protect my assets from his greed. I'm still me, just with some new challenges. Thank you for reminding me that I'm worth fighting for." These letters filled a file cabinet, then two, then an entire room. Each one was a testament to the power of standing up to bullies, even when those bullies shared your DNA. The foundation had also inspired copycats, other organizations dedicated to protecting vulnerable adults from family predators. Lawyers across the country were specializing in elder protection law, support groups were forming for victims of financial abuse, and legislators were passing stronger laws to prevent guardianship fraud. Arthur's trap for Robert had become a movement, his final lesson radiating outward like ripples in a pond, touching lives he could never have imagined when he'd crafted those careful legal words. On a crisp morning in November, exactly 7 years after Arthur's death, I received an unexpected visitor. I was in my kitchen making coffee in the same pot Arthur and I had used for decades when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw a young man in his early 20s, tall and lean with Robert's jawline but something softer in his eyes. He wore a college sweatshirt and carried a backpack that suggested he'd traveled a long way. It was Tommy, Robert's son from his first marriage, now grown into a man I barely recognized. "Grandma Elizabeth," he said when I opened the door, his voice uncertain but hopeful. "I know I should have called, but I wasn't sure if, after everything that happened with Dad." I pulled him into a hug that lasted longer than either of us expected. He felt solid and real, this grandson I'd watched grow from a distance, this boy who'd been caught in the crossfire of his father's choices. "Come in, sweetheart," I said, leading him to the kitchen where the morning light was warmest. "Sit down and tell me everything." Over coffee and the cinnamon rolls I'd learned to make from his great-grandmother's recipe, Tommy told me his story. He'd graduated from college the previous spring with a degree in social work, inspired by his own experience of family dysfunction and his desire to help others navigate similar challenges. "I've been following the foundation's work," he said, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug like he was drawing warmth from it, "reading about the cases you've won, the people you've helped. It made me realize that what happened to you wasn't just about Dad's greed, it was part of a bigger problem." He looked around the kitchen, taking in the unchanged details that had anchored his childhood visits. The rooster clock on the wall, the ceramic cookie jar shaped like an apple, the window over the sink where morning light painted rainbows through my crystal collection. "I wanted to ask, would you consider letting me work for the foundation? I know I don't have much experience, but I understand what it's like to watch family members choose money over love. I understand what it feels like to lose the people you thought you could count on." The boy who'd once fallen asleep on my porch swing listening to stories about his grandfather had grown into a man who wanted to protect other grandparents from the same betrayal I'd endured. "Tommy," I said, reaching across the table to take his hand, "your grandfather would be so proud of the man you've become." Not because of your degree or your career plans, but because you learned the most important lesson he tried to teach. That character isn't something you inherit, it's something you choose every single day. He smiled, and for a moment I saw Arthur in the curve of his mouth, the steady warmth in his eyes. Does that mean I'm hired? That means you're home, I said. As I write these words, 10 years have passed since that morning in my sunroom when I thought my story was ending. The Sterling Shield Foundation now operates in 12 states. Tommy has become our director of client services, and the mantelpiece in my sunroom holds over 200 carved roses, each one a life saved, a family protected, a victory for dignity over greed. My hair is whiter now, my hands more lined, my steps perhaps a little slower, but I am not diminished. I am not obsolete. I am not a problem to be solved or an obstacle to be removed. I am a woman who learned that the most powerful move you can make is to quietly, patiently, and completely prove wrong those who underestimate you. Every morning, I still sit in the sunroom Arthur built for me, drinking coffee from the mug Tommy made in kindergarten art class, watching the sun paint the world in shades of gold and possibility. The house around me breathes with the contentment of a home well loved, its walls holding not just my memories but my ongoing story. The garden beyond the windows blooms with flowers I've planted in the years since Robert and Victoria left, roses that climb the trellis Arthur built, lavender that perfumes the evening air, herbs that flavor the meals I cook for Tommy and the volunteers who have become my chosen family. Sometimes I think about the choice Robert made, the path that led him away from love and toward emptiness. I wonder if he ever drives past the farm where George Hendricks still grows corn, if he ever reads about the Sterling Shield Foundation in the news, if he ever remembers the father who tried to teach him that some things are more valuable than money. But these wondering moments pass like shadows across the sun. My life is too full of purpose to spend much time mourning what could have been. If you have ever been made to feel like your mind is failing, like your life is a problem to be solved, like you are an obstacle standing in the way of someone else's inheritance, remember this: the truest measure of a person's character is how they treat those they believe have no power. And sometimes the most powerful move you can make is to remind them and yourself that they're wrong. The roses on my mantelpiece catch the morning light, each carved petal a promise kept, each stone flower a life preserved. Arthur built his monuments to last, and through them, through me, through every person we've protected, his legacy continues to grow. Some gardens bloom in spring and fade by winter. But the garden of lives touched, protected, and saved blooms eternal, a living monument to the truth that love, real love, builds rather than destroys, protects rather than exploits, lifts up rather than tears down. My name is Elizabeth Sterling, and this is not the end of my story. This is just the beginning of forever. If this story touched your heart the way it touched ours, please hit that subscribe button and give us a thumbs up. Your support means everything to us and helps us bring you more stories of courage, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right. Tell us in the comments below, what would you have done in Margaret's situation?